Hello everyone. So the next 2 weeks we'll be discussing evolution. We're not going to get too far in depth in it, but because it is 4 separate chapters, I wanted to spread it out over 2 weeks. So this will be the first set, and let's go on. So today we're going to talk about the introduction to evolution. We'll talk about the history of evolution, evolution of populations, and misconceptions about evolution. So Charles Darwin was the guy who came up with the theory of natural selection. He first published his theory in The Origin of Species. That was his book title in 1859. That's a picture of Charles Darwin. So the book detailed his theory that organisms adapt to their environment to survive. And natural selection was the mechanism of evolution. We'll get into what those mean in just a minute. So natural selection is just descent with modification. As you can see with these giraffes over here, only the tall giraffe can reach up and catch the leaves. That means that the other ones aren't able to eat as much, and they will probably die off. So the natural environment selects certain traits to get passed along to the next generation. That tall giraffe will pass on its tall genes, and so the next generation will then be tall because that giraffe was able to survive and make it to the next generation, so it will pass on its traits. This happens because those with better traits, in this case, the one that are taller, are able to survive to reproduce. Those two shorter ones will probably not be able to create offspring because they're not going to survive long enough to be able to reproduce because they're not getting enough food. So here's a natural selection example. We have a population of mice here that just moved into an area where rocks are very dark. Due to natural genetic variation, so differences in between them, some mice are black while others are tan. So some mice are eaten by birds. Tan mice are more visible to predatory birds than the black mice because they're on a black background. Thus, the tan mice are eaten at a higher frequency than the black mice. Only the surviving mice reach reproductive age and leave offspring. So when you look, our population changes greatly. Only those black ones are able to reproduce and make more of themselves because they're able to reach reproductive age. Those tan ones, they're either going to have to be really fast or be able to hide better because they're on this black background. They're very easy to see and the birds will pick them off. So that's how natural selection is working. The mice just aren't turning black through evolution, but all the tan ones are going away because they're being eaten by the hawk or whichever kind of bird it is. So getting into the history of evolution. So evolution is descent with modification, just like we've been talking about. So you're descendant from your ancestors, but you modified it just a little bit. So information about these changes we can gather through fossils. Fossils are any remnants or traces of organisms that are found in soil. Darwin was not the first person to study how these organisms change over time. Paleontologists came up with this and helped him form his hypothesis. He was really just the first one to gather all the data and write it down. Okay, so paleontology is the study of fossils. Over time, layers of soil settle to form layers. These layers are often called strata. Your older strata will be at the bottom, so rocks grow upwards, or the rock and debris do grow upwards. This was developed by Cuvier, who noted that fossils in older strata were more dissimilar to current life forms. So the further into a rock formation that you go, the older the fossils will be in the order that the rocks are. So Cuvier strongly opposed the idea of evolution. He believed that each strata represented a catastrophic event where species died and that area was repopulated with different species. So he believes that we aren't descendant from those animals, that all of those animals died off and new ones came in. This guy is Lamarck. He also talked about evolution. His main idea is called inheritance of acquired characteristics. And this was the reigning theory for quite a while. But many other scientists positioned that evolution occurs through subtle changes, but not how these changes occur. So before Darwin came along and said that these changes were occurring, people already knew that. People knew that we were changing over time, but no one knew how we were changing. So John Baptiste Lamarck was actually the first guy to try to explain how this life changes. And he did that through two different mechanisms. So he called them use and disuse. And like I said earlier, inheritance of acquired characteristics. So his use and disuse theory, saying that parts of the body that are used extensively become larger and stronger, and those that aren't used will deteriorate. Essentially, he's the one that came up with use it or lose it. So he said that a giraffe's neck gets longer if it tries to reach higher limbs. So if you look at our giraffe picture on the right-hand side, he's saying that these short giraffes who weren't trying to reach the trees kept their short necks, while giraffes that tried to reach up higher into the trees gained longer necks. This is false, because this also would mean that you can change your genetics, and trust me, if I could change that, I would be a whole lot taller than I am. But it doesn't work this way. So the second half of Lamarck's theory was inheritance of acquired characteristics. So the stronger and weaker parts get passed on to the next generation. For example, this long-necked giraffe in this thing, like I said earlier, was able to pass on its genes and create more long-necked offspring, while the short-necked individuals died off before they were able to reproduce, and so they were not able to create more offsprings with short necks. So the short-necked variety did go away. I do want to go back to this slide real quick. Why are you not letting me go backwards? Okay, so the use and disuse theory is kind of true in a way when it comes to like your muscles. If you don't use your muscles, people who lay down a lot, so like people in nursing homes and hospitals and things like that, do tend to have their muscles atrophy, which is where your muscles just kind of get weaker, and that's kind of where this theory came from. Again, your muscles aren't going to go away. You can gain back that strength, but it's not inherently true, because you're not just going to grow a longer neck because you strain your neck a little bit. All right. So about 20 years after Lamarck's theory was published, Darwin started his adventure through the Galapagos on a ship called the Beagle. So the Beagle traveled through the Canary Islands along the coast of South America to the Galapagos Islands, which are down there in South America. You can kind of see them on this left-hand side of South America. He also traveled around Australia, the tip of South Africa, and then came back to England. He did most of his research, however, in the Galapagos Islands with the finches. If you've ever heard of Darwin's finches. All right, I assumed we were going to get into them. So during his voyage, Darwin observed many examples of adaptations, inherited characteristics that develop with survival. The most famous observation was the beaks of the Galapagos finches that were adapted for specific diets, so many species could survive on one small island. Each species evolved to feed on different foods. So if all the birds on that island were going to eat the same food, either the food was going to run out and kill all the birds, or everyone was just going to die. So the birds through evolution developed niches. So each one started eating different foods. And those that were able to eat different foods were able to pass on those traits to their offspring. So if you see this cactus eating up here, you can see he's got kind of a strong beak. He can break through that cactus flower and eat the nectar and stuff of the cactus. This insect eating finch right here has a smaller, narrow beak, so it can get into trees and it can catch those insects. And then the finch at the bottom has a very strong, thick beak so that it's able to crack those seeds open and eat seeds. Darwin realized that these adaptations occurred through natural selection when he published his book, The Origin of Species, in 1859. Natural selection is a process that individuals who have certain traits tend to survive and reproduce at higher rates than those who have other traits. It's important to take into account the cultural and worldview of the time and how Darwin's theory was and still is controversial. So in 1890s, whenever Darwin did publish The Origin of Species and was defending it, Europe had this theory that God and science were intertwined. So God made everything. And science kind of needs to stay out of it. Darwin said that God and science can exist separately. Darwin did believe that there was a higher deity, but he also believed in this science. So again, in 1890s Europe, it says that man is special and we're above all other creatures. But Darwin said man evolved from other creatures. In The Origin of Species, Darwin never explicitly stated that humans evolved from ape-like ancestors, but he did say that humans, like all other creatures, evolved from species that have been on the earth before us. In Europe, every member of a class or population of people is identical, but Darwin said every person is different or varied. We have lots of variation and it's necessary for our survival. If everybody had the same traits and we had something come through, everything would die. So like with the bubonic plague, some people were just more immune to it than others, and so it wiped out a great bit of people who weren't, but those people who were immune to it were able to survive. Each class of people is different from other classes. So Darwin said all organisms come from a common ancestor. So poor people, rich people, we all came from a common ancestor. No one person is better than another. So it's important to note that scientists do build on previous work. Darwin built on and analyzed the work of those who came before him. So even though Cuvier was inaccurate, was mostly inaccurate, Darwin was able to use his fossil record and fossil data to come up with his theory of evolution. It's also kind of interesting to note that there was a gentleman who was coming up with evolution at the same time that Darwin was. His name was Alfred Russel Wallace. He was actually publishing a paper at the same time that Darwin was on evolution, because Darwin sat on his theory for a long time thinking that England would not accept it. But when he saw that other people were coming up with his idea and were publishing it, Darwin went ahead and published Origin of the Species. So that's why Darwin is awarded the father of natural selection, because he's the first one who actually put a paper out on that. And so since Darwin's theory of evolution has come out, we now understand why why evolution works, because there's been quite a bit of work done in genetics through Gregor Mendel. Gregor Mendel was the father of genetics, and he came up with a lot of genetics. And so we put with genetics and evolution at the same time, we understand how traits are passed on and how that then leads to evolution. So remember the dark and light mouse example, but how does natural selection occur on the genetic level? So when you look at it, genetic variation is what makes evolution possible. So it's a good thing that we're all different. Genetically speaking, all populations contain individuals with genetic variations within their code. Some of us have darker hair, some of us have lighter hair. All of our skin tones are different, eye color. That's a good thing, because like I did the example with the bubonic plague, if we all didn't have those minute traces in genetic variability, then one little illness, one little sickness will come through and wipe out everyone. So it's good to have that genetic variation within our genetic code. So genetic variation can happen through changes in genetic material and through reproductive processes. Genetic variation due to changes in the genetic information. So we can have mutations. You can have formations of new alleles by mutation. So any kind of small change that happens in the nucleotide sequence of the DNA. Sometimes it's for better, sometimes it's for worse. One mutation that does happen is sickle cell anemia, and that is a one nucleotide change within blood cells, red blood cells. So like I said, sometimes it's better, sometimes it's for the worse, like in sickle cell. Or there can be an alternation in the gene number or position. So any kind of chromosomal changes that alter genes. One big chromosomal change is trisomy 21 or Down syndrome. That is a very big change. There's a whole nother chromosome or part of a chromosome extra that's not supposed to be there, but that does lead to genetic variation. So genetic variation due to reproduction, making another generation of individuals. So rapid reproduction mutations are more likely when reproduction happens quickly, such as in viruses. So that's why viruses change so quickly, because they reproduce very quickly. And we have a SARS-CoV-2, which is the coronavirus, up at the top. This is also why you need to get a flu shot every year, because the flu mutates very quickly, and so every year it's a new strain, so we have to get a flu shot every year. Also, sexual reproduction, you can see in that little GIF at the bottom, the chromosomes switching off. Whenever your mom and dad's chromosomes came together, they were able to switch off genetic material to kind of put together a new series of alleles to create you, and it randomizes traits. So we also have geographical variation. So species can exhibit geographical location and be different based on geographical separations of their populations. I don't remember exactly where it was, but there are ants in South America where on one side of the mountain, the ants are black, and on the other side of the mountain, they are red. And that's just a geographical variation. There's really no need for them to be different colors. They don't do different things. Just one side's black and one side's red. And it could be that on the side with the red, that there's a lot of red leaves that fall. There's a lot of red grass. And so they're able to hide better from predators. But natural selection can contribute to those genetic variations by modifying gene frequencies in response to differences in local environmental factors. So exactly like I said, maybe one side of the mountain has a lot more, like in this picture, a lot more red grass. And so they're able to hide better. And then the other side might have just ground. So it's a little bit easier for those black, brownish ants to blend in. So in evolution of population, one common misconception that a lot of people have is that evolution can happen to an individual. That's not the case. Evolution is a population-based phenomenon, so it happens to entire populations. Excuse me. It happens to entire populations, not just one person. And it affects the survival and reproductive rate to an entire population. Yep. So getting into some more misconceptions about evolution. All mutations are bad. That's not true. There are some good mutations. One mutation, like I said, is the just like the mice. So it could have been a mutation that caused the black colored mice, but that mutation is good because then they are actually able to survive in their environment. Or like with the giraffes, it could have been a mutation that caused that one giraffe to have a longer neck, but it's able to survive and get food and pass on those traits. Or like this example that's on this slide, a bacteria suffered a mutation, but that made it resistant to antibiotics. And if you were to take an antibiotic, that cell would survive and pass on its traits to the next generation. Another myth, organisms evolve to adapt to their environment. In reality, individuals do not evolve, populations do. So again, the long-necked giraffe was able to pass on its traits. It had a mutation, passed on its traits, the population evolved by killing off those ones that couldn't get food, and the offspring that could get food because of their long necks survived. So our population changed and evolved over time, but the individual did not. Another common misconception, the biggest, strongest, or fastest individuals are the ones who survive through survival of the fittest. When we talk about fitness in biology, we're talking about that they're adapted to their environment. We're not talking about, like Terry Crews here, you got to be buff and strong. That's not what we're going for. Fitness in a biological sense is talking about that they're better adapted to their environment. So the black mice have a better fitness than the white mice. It doesn't matter which one's bigger, it doesn't matter which one's stronger. The black mice will always have a higher fitness interval because of the fact that they're better adapted to their environment. All right, and here's a short little TED Talk. I believe it's like 4 or 5 minutes. Just talking about some more myths and misconceptions about evolution.
Myths and misconceptions about evolution. Let's talk about evolution. You've probably heard that some people consider it controversial, even though most scientists don't. But even if you aren't one of those people, and you think you have a pretty good understanding of evolution, chances are you still believe some things about it that aren't entirely right. Things like, evolution is organisms adapting to their environment. This was an earlier, now discredited theory of evolution. Almost 60 years before Darwin published his book, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck proposed that creatures evolve by developing certain traits over their lifetimes, and then passing those on to their offspring. For example, he thought that because giraffes spent their lives stretching to reach leaves on higher branches, their children would be born with longer necks. But we know now that's not how genetic inheritance works. In fact, individual organisms don't evolve at all. Instead, random genetic mutations cause some giraffes to be born with longer necks, and that gives them a better chance to survive than the ones who weren't so lucky. Which brings us to survival of the fittest. This makes it sound like evolution always favors the biggest, strongest, or fastest creatures, which is not really the case. For one thing, evolutionary fitness is just a matter of how well suited they are to their current environment. If all the tall trees suddenly died out and only short grass was left, all those long-necked giraffes would be at a disadvantage. Secondly, survival is not how evolution occurs. Reproduction is. and the world is full of creatures like the male anglerfish, which is so small and ill-suited for survival at birth that it has to quickly find a mate before it dies. But at least we can say that if an organism dies without reproducing, it's evolutionarily useless, right? Wrong. Remember, natural selection happens not at the organism level, but at the genetic level. And the same gene that exists in one organism will also exist in its relatives. So a gene that makes an animal altruistically sacrifice itself to help the survival and future reproduction of its siblings or cousins can become more widespread than one that is solely concerned with self-preservation. Anything that lets more copies of the gene pass on to the next generation will serve its purpose. Except evolutionary purpose. One of the most difficult things to keep in mind about evolution is that when we say things like, genes want to make more copies of themselves, or even natural selection, we're actually using metaphors. A gene doesn't want anything, and there's no outside mechanism that selects which genes are best to preserve. All that happens is that random genetic mutations cause the organisms carrying them to behave or develop in different ways. Some of those ways result in more copies of the mutated gene being passed on, and so forth. Nor is there any predetermined plan progressing towards an ideal form. It's not ideal for the human eye to have a blind spot where the optic nerve exits the retina, but that's how it developed, starting from a simple photoreceptor cell. In retrospect, it would have been much more advantageous for humans to crave nutrients and vitamins rather than just calories. But over the millennia, during which our ancestors evolved, calories were scarce, and there was nothing to anticipate that this would later change so quickly. So, evolution proceeds blindly, step by step by step, creating all of the diversity we see in the natural world.
All right, so that was just a really brief overview of everything we've talked about. If you couldn't really hear it, I do have the PowerPoint posted, so you can still go and view this at your leisure. But moving on. Oh, Lord. All right. So the PowerPoint I did post online, I had to change this and I just haven't reposted it. So if you look at it, it says that chapters 22 through 25 reading quizzes are due on the PowerPoint that I posted, but it's just chapter 22 and 23 this week. Next week will be 24 and 25. So those will be due by Sunday the 5th. And also the evolution assignment in Pearson will be open. That is not due until the following Sunday, which would be the 12th, I believe. So you'll have 2 full weeks to complete this evolution assignment. It should take anywhere between 30 and 40 minutes to complete, and you can come in and out of that as you please. The reading quizzes are all 10 questions apiece out of a bank of between 40 and 60 questions. So those should take you about 5 to 10 minutes to complete. Please let me know if you have any questions. My email is always open. Thank you. Have a wonderful day.